How are we doing, ladies and gentlemen? Are we doing there? Refreshed? Suitably refreshed. Put the candidates back. Yep. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Most of you have come back, which is a really, really good sign. Two exciting things happened during the interval. One of which was that we found a mobile phone, which means if no one claims it, we've got a raffle. Hooray! So come and see me if you're missing your mobile phone. The second of which was our ridiculous straw poll, which should be dealt with complete contempt, which had, in reverse order, shall we do that? Reverse order. In joint final place, both the Liberal Democrat and Left Unity with 6 straws each. This is... Okay, this really has gone a bit panto. Okay, and then after that was UKIP with 11 straws. And then we had the Green Party with 25 straws. Hey! Ooh. Hey! Be the signs at the front. Undecided, 26, which is incredible news. So if the election was held today, it's 26. Which actually, when you look at the proportion of the people in the room, would be a complete game changer for the politicians. So that's why I still think it's incredibly important we have these kinds of things. The Conservatives have 30 straws, and 30, and Labour coming in top with 67 straws. Quite what on earth that tells you, I have no idea, but do put another straw in the pot when you leave, and it's on who you think has done best up here tonight, and we'll take it from there. We need to go back to Joel, because Joel is the only person that hasn't asked a question first. I got inundated with requests in just 20 minutes there, and there's so many of you in here that have got burning questions, so after Joel's answered his question first, we'll go left to right again, but if we can keep it really short, that'd be brilliant, because these guys have got lots of questions for you, and I'm determined to get through as many as we can here in the room. So, over to Joel. We've got, what is the biggest challenge facing Exeter in the next term of office, and what would you do to fix it?
Yeah. I think one of the challenges which as a city we face is trying to provide opportunities for young people. Whether they be apprenticeships and things, or whether they be opportunities to try and keep lots of the highly skilled graduates from the university here in Exeter. I think that's a real challenge, but I think it's one which we've started to make inroads in. The apprenticeship scheme has been massively expanded under this government. There have been 2 million apprenticeships which have started under this government, which is an 85% increase on the previous Labour administration. And what that actually represents is almost 4,000 apprenticeships which have been started here in Exeter since 2010, which is a great start. But I think as well we need to try and make sure that we're keeping graduates from the university here in Exeter as well, and providing opportunities to people whatever their situation is.
Brilliant, thank you. Ben, what's the biggest problem?
Well, I think probably the biggest single challenge that we will face is housing. We've talked a lot about quite a lot already. So let me say that I think Exeter's biggest challenge is probably managing our growth sustainably. I think it's great that our city is a successful city and it's grown well over the last couple of decades, and I think we have very bright prospects. I think we've got great natural assets, the university, the innovation centre, the Met Office, reasonably good transport links, but they need improving. But I think the kind of pressures, the negatives that, if you like, that I get on the doorstep from people in Exeter are around things like traffic congestion, the uncontrolled development that's taking place on Exeter's borders, particularly at Pinho and Althington, where because of the local district councils outside Exeter, East Devon and Teambridge, not having had a proper local plan approved, in East Devon's case still hasn't, which is outrageous, means that developers have a free-for-all on the edge of our city. And it's very frustrating for people who live in Pinho and Althington to see this uncontrolled development taking place. We need a much better plan, like the kind of new settlement that the Labour government planned and begun to deliver at Cranbrook, where you've got proper investment, you've got the services in there, the infrastructure in there, rather than just this planning free-for-all. So I think that is, in a nutshell, is Exeter's biggest challenge, is managing our success and our growth, which are great, but sustainably.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I've tried to do things quite differently on my campaign, and I've tried to, it's difficult for me sometimes, but try to listen first before I open my mouth. So we delivered 72,000 surveys, which almost killed me and gave me the man flu over Christmas, and the team weren't very happy, but 72,000 surveys, we knock on thousands of doors a month, and that's what built my 6-point plan for Exeter. And I think from that, it was quite clear that infrastructure is perhaps the biggest challenge that's threatening to choke off our city's growth and stop Exeter from becoming extraordinary. And I actually think we need something quite radical in the city. We have infrastructure that's quite old, and it has high density housing either side of it, and the obvious wedge and river, which makes things quite difficult. And so I think we need to think quite radically, and I think we also need to figure out how we're going to fund something that's likely to be quite expensive. But I think undoubtedly it's infrastructure that risks threatening the success that the city is starting to enjoy.
Thank you. Keith, what's the biggest problem facing Exeter?
I agree with Ben. Actually, it's houses. Push your mic over, Keith. You can't hear you. No, keep it where it is. I didn't hear the comment, but I was going to say there's a lot out there who don't want to anyway. Right, so it's housing. Okay? I think so. Can you hear me? Yeah. Do you want to hear me? Okay, so it's housing. How we actually fix that. We build more houses. Now, there is a European portal. It's called the Euro Portal. And the last time I looked, and it's where all the European countries advertise for jobs. And the last time I looked, there was 2.5 million jobs advertised in the EU countries. There were 880,000 from the UK jobs advertised in Europe. There were 2 from Croatia. Now, what I'm saying is there's still about 750,000 18 to 24-year-olds in this country unemployed, not in training and not in education. And also, if somebody is moving from one of the EU countries to here to take up a job, he can claim up to £1,000 in relocation costs. But we're going to stop all that. We're going to stop the advertising for jobs, which is a priority for Exeter, along with housing as I see it. We're going to stop that. And hopefully, it will be British jobs for British people. British jobs for British people. Now, my left-wing friends, let me tell you something. Farage said this about 2 weeks ago. British jobs for British people. He was slagged off. So they tried to humiliate him. All the media. Until in the evening, he said, well, actually, Gordon Brown said that when he was Prime Minister. What happened then? Nothing. The left wing went on and started another campaign. Now,
Keith, you okay?
You will hear from the politicians, and they still say it. They used to say there was 3,000 jobs that we'll lose coming out of the EU. Now they say there are 3,000 jobs at risk. At risk. It's a myth. They're not at risk. The imbalance between imports and exports between us and the EU is £29 billion per year. So we're importing £29 billion worth of goods more than we're exporting. That's one good reason, I think, why they won't actually stop it dead, will they? And if this myth of 3,000 jobs at risk is there, then there must be 5,000 euro jobs at risk. You're ended the lesson.
Thank you. Ed?
Well, I mean, personally, I don't think it reflects that well on Nigel Farage that he's borrowing one of the most mistaken slogans that Gordon Brown ever came out with. I think they're both wrong. They're both completely wrong. But anyway, this is supposed to be about Exeter, so I'm going to talk about Exeter and what the biggest priority for it is. I think, I mean, there's been a lot said about housing, but it's been well covered. And I think, apart from that, the biggest challenge facing us has to be protecting our public services.
the impact of austerity that's being handed down by the central government is going to be catastrophic. We have seen nothing yet. And even in Exeter, we're seeing things a lot worse than we're seeing elsewhere in the country. For instance, we're seeing bus services being cut right back. The B bus has already been taken away from a lot of its route. The T bus, which links us to Topsham, is up to the chop as well. And that's going to be catastrophic for whole communities and also the people in those communities who rely on bus services. People who don't have a car, people who are disabled, people who, young mothers, all of these sorts of people. It's going to have a catastrophic impact on them. Going further than that, obviously, there's the problems with the NHS. I've mentioned the crisis in A&E, but it's affecting us particularly locally. I've seen it written that the NHS in Devon is like the canary in the coal mine. It's the first to go out of the country. I'm sure we all saw the proposals to reduce elective procedures so that if you have cataracts, you'll only get it, one eye operated on. If you have if you need a hearing aid, you'll only get it for one ear. I wish I was joking and making this up. These are actual proposals that would come out with. So, there's that, and there's further attempts to tear apart these services, and by extension, tear apart the fabric of our society. We need to fight back against that. We need to fight back against the closures and stand up for decently run, publicly owned, well-funded services which actually benefit all of us. So that's our goal.
Ed's points about austerity are absolutely right, and the situation is going to be made worse by, as I said in my introduction, the growth of Exeter in the next 10 years. And Ben talked about the fact that there is uncontrolled sprawl in neighbouring districts, but that uncontrolled sprawl has been backed in the core strategy approved and supported by Labour in terms of the growth of the city. So actually we need to be thinking about how the decisions are going to be made today that actually join up, because there is no coherent transport strategy for the city which makes it easier to get around. We've talked about there's increasing gridlock. We need to have electrified buses. We need to be able to walk and cycle in a coherent network that needs to be made safe in places. And we need to be making sure that the decisions that are made are actually ones which are going to future-proof us to tackle the problem of climate change. So, for example, with the incinerator, the heat is being proposed to be piped in all different directions around the city, including to the southwest of Exeter. The Green Party would build houses to the passive house standard, and I would commend the Labour Council here, because they do build their council houses to the passive house standard. And we need all houses to be built in Exeter. But the government has watered down the housing standards, so people are going to have expensive homes to heat. So the Green Party would review and reform the planning framework to put control back in local hands so that we can have decisions made by people who understand how their city works, rather than having developers coming in who are going to bring their business plans from somewhere else and plonk it on the edge of Exeter, and people are going to have to put up with it.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take the moment we're live broadcasting tonight, the entire might of the Expression Echo outside broadcast unit, which is that iPad propped up on that book over there. It's actually doing really well this evening. We've had loads of comments on Twitter. Dom, every single question we've had via Twitter has been addressed to you this evening, and I don't know what that says about Twitter. For the whole show. But I would like to take one from Twitter as a general thing, bearing in mind that a lot of people are actually watching this at home, God bless them. So back down to Ben, how would the candidates vote on repeal of the Hunting Act? Do they support the culling of badgers? And that comes from Blue Beat Badger via Twitter.
No, I would not vote to repeal the Hunting Act. I'm very proud of the Labour government's Hunting Act. I think it was unnecessary, cruel chasing of foxes and stags, incidentally, using hounds. And on the badger cull, I accept that TB is a really serious problem for farmers, for cattle, and for badgers themselves. But I think we need an approach that is based on science, and all of the scientific evidence suggests that the cull carried out by this government will simply make matters worse. And I believe in evidence-based policy.
Dom.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm standing for Parliament is because I think career politicians have done our democracy a disservice, and there's a Westminster, West Country disconnect. And part of that, to get around that, I made a contract with Exeter, and the first line of my contract with Exeter says I'll put Exeter first above myself and my party. And on fox hunting and on the badger cull, I found myself a little bit torn because I'm a farmer's son. I've grown up in the countryside, and I feel as a rule that career politicians in Westminster are probably better off doing a bit less interfering in rural livelihoods and rural communities rather than more. So that's where I come from in my gut instinct. But I'm, I've moved away from the farm and worked overseas and whatever else, and came back a year ago. And Exeter is an urban constituency, and so what I've done is I've launched a video and a consultation process, and I've asked people what their thoughts are in Exeter, and that consultation comes to an end. I can't remember when it is. Early next week.
Have you hunted?
So what's your view, Dom?
Well, can I finish my answer? So on Tuesday, next Tuesday, whenever it is, I will take my job seriously of representing the views of this constituency, and if this constituency says that I should vote against hunting, I will. I've never hunted. I'm not pro-fox hunting. It's not something that I've done or something I'm particularly pro of. And in terms of the badger cull, I think the science is mixed, frankly. I've met farmers who have had their livelihoods devastated, people that work on farms where their lives have been devastated, and the badger number has exploded in this country, and the primary sufferers are the badgers and cattle affected by this process. But I've made my position clear. I'm ambivalent about fox hunting. The badger cull is mixed, but I think the trial should go on. But if the consultation comes back and people say that I should vote against fox hunting and vote against the badger cull, I will. And I think, that's the right thing to do.
UKIP as a whole is not against hunting, but the way we play it is we have a referendum, county by county referendum, and the people then would choose whether they wanted fox hunting or not. And that would be a binding referendum, so you would get some counties where they allow it, where they have fox hunting, some where they don't.
Keith, what do you think? In your view, do you think?
I never fox hunt. I have nothing against fox hunting myself. I hate the word toe the party line. I don't actually toe the party line. I've explained how we will play it. The people, the people that we represent will have their say. And they will decide, the people, a binding referendum. And UKIP is all about binding referendums, whether it's building, whether it's this, whether it's that. A binding referendum. And then, all those who sit at home watching the TV and don't get up and actually participate in a referendum, they've got nothing to complain about. They will, but they really haven't.
Thank you. Ed?
Don't bother with clap, it's all right.
Well, proposing county by county referendum isn't something I've heard of before. I look forward to.
I haven't listened to UKIP because we.
No, I probably haven't. No. I look forward with great enthusiasm to the first prosecutions where a hunt chases a fox across a county line. From a county where it's legal to one where it's not. That'll be fantastic. I mean, there seems to come up, all the time. I don't understand it. Who are these people who keep sort of thrusting this into the public debate? Who really wants to kill foxes so badly that they think this is an election issue? No, of course we're not going to repeal the Hunting Act. I think I've signed up for the League Against Cruel Sports petition on this. You can check online. I think we should abolish all of these cruel sports and just have them.
Diana?
The Green Party does not believe in killing animals for sport. We would not support a repeal of the Hunting Act, and the culling of badgers has gone against the scientific evidence from DEFRA, and it's been a very expensive exercise, and it actually hasn't achieved any of its objectives. We need to have some better science to inform decision making so that farmers can understand how they can manage badgers on their land, and how policymakers make decisions which are based on science and not some ideology.
Yeah, very quickly, I wouldn't vote to repeal the Hunting Act. I think it's indicative of the fact that we want to try and be a humane society, that we've outlawed that sort of practice. In terms of the badges, I don't think this is an ideological issue. I think we need to try and find a humane and sustainable solution based on the science. And if that involves culling a certain number of badges in a humane way, then I wouldn't be opposed to it. But I think we need to try and base any such decision on the science.
Okay, lovely. Right, we'll very much keep it in the room now. Rob's on his feet. There's a lady there in yellow with a hand up there. Rob, if you got there first. Panel, you can keep your answers as short as possible so we can get through as many people as possible. We've got lots of eager people with their hands up.
Thank you. I'm sure we all agree that building a new bus station in Exeter, whilst at the same time reducing the number of bus services, is somewhat ironic. It strikes me as counterintuitive to have such a redevelopment plan but to not address the proposed bus service cuts, which would affect late-night businesses. What are the candidates' plans for addressing this issue? Thank you.
Start with you, John. Yep.
I've come out against the bus cuts. Again, sound like a stuck record, but my contract for Exeter says I'll put the city first. I've said already that I think infrastructure is one of the most important things in this city. And first and foremost, we need a public bus service that people can get around the city, particularly people that don't have cars and elderly people. So I came out against the Conservative County Council. I understand where they're coming from. They're in particularly difficult circumstances financially, but I think it's not in Exeter's interest. So I came out against it.
Keith?
Transport is very important, and Exeter needs it as much as anybody else. I don't understand this though. If I was in business producing a bus service, I wouldn't cut a bus service if it was making money. So when the person said, the Topsham bus route is in jeopardy, you're going to cut that. It must be because the people aren't using it. If the people aren't using it, why aren't they using it? Is it the timings? Is it the route? Or is it because they'd rather go into town in a car? I just don't. I can understand the business element of it in that if people aren't using it, why supply it?
I put it out there, but I suppose it's because not everyone's got a car, I can imagine, and not everyone can drive. But yeah, we'll come along the panel.
In terms of why the T-bus is being cut, it's not to do with too few people using it, it's to do with lack of funding to local government, being handed down by a central government, run by the Tories, and it means that Devon County Council is having to make £46 million of cuts in funding to bus subsidies. Now, why the hell we're subsidising a private, profitable corporation like Stagecoach to turn a profit on the services, I don't know. Even the name of it, a public bus service, to me implies actually there shouldn't be a middleman, a profitable corporation bringing off the profits while we lose routes that are important to us. And as I mentioned before, it's people who are vulnerable, people who can't afford a car, don't have one for other reasons, that rely on these services the most. So I think we're actually the only alternative at this election, not only calling for public ownership of the rail system, which is something that a few people support, but we actually think that buses should be publicly owned and run as well. We would take them all into public ownership, we'd plan them democratically, so that people can have the services that they actually need, and it can be decided on democratically through local government control. And I hope that people will support me in that. I don't know whether they will, but I think that's the way forward.
Thank you, Ed.
Okay, and just to mention the redevelopment of the bus station, one thing I want to air publicly for any councillors that might be listening is that the manager of Stagecoach is very concerned that the bus station is not going to be big enough to allow the maintenance of both diesel buses and electric buses. And that's going to prevent the development of the bus service in the future, because we need to transfer to electric buses to reduce the pollution in Exeter. The buses across Devon are going to be cut by 1.7 million. This is absolutely going to devastate our bus network. It takes years to build up a bus network, and I could make a joke about them 3 coming along at once, but I won't. In Exeter, that means it's cuts to 5 bus services and shop mobility as well, and this will affect 44,000 passengers. Now, we've put in a petition signed by hundreds of people to Devon County Council, and a lot of people have filled in our forms to say how the cuts are going to affect them. And if you look at who's being affected, it is women, older people and people with disabilities. And this is absolutely wrong. And I want to say two things. First of all, we need to support more community-owned buses so that people can then determine the bus services that they want. And Devon County Council should be cutting the money that it spends on PFI and PPP. It's propping up large corporate companies with huge bills that we pay for PFI, and that's what should be cut, not services such as these to people who really need them.
Move on the bus. Joel.
One of the Democrat policy which we've been looking to bring in is to introduce a young people's discount card for people between the ages of 16 to 19, which give them 2/3 off on public transport, to enable young people to travel to college, to travel to jobs and things, to try and support them. But obviously this does rather presuppose that there are services which they would be able to use with that card, which highlights the fact that we do need to improve our transport infrastructure. Yes, because it will help, on the one hand it will help residents, and on the other hand it will help businesses. But actually, there's a more important reason as well, which is because we want to encourage people to use public transport for the sake of the environment. Because actually, we've talked a bit on the panel already about how, well, perhaps it's just that people are using cars, but actually we've got pretty good reasons why, even if that is the case, we want to try and encourage people not to use cars, and in fact to use public transport, for the sake of the environment. And this links in as well to another issue which has come up this evening, which is about congestion in the city. If we can get people to use public transport by providing good levels of public transport, then we'll help to solve congestion and we'll be helping the environment.
Ben.
To return to the questioner, yes, it does appear pretty anomalous, doesn't it, that there is a proposal to provide a new bus station while Devon County Council is cutting the bus services. I think the difference here is that Exeter City Council is the sponsoring authority of the bus station in Sybil Street development, and it's part of a package of redevelopment there, and hopefully an indication that Exeter City Council sees a good long-term future in bus services and in improved bus services, and it's the County Council that in the short term, hopefully, are cutting the bus services, and I'm pleased that Don has announced his opposition to this, given that Ed is absolutely right. These cuts are being imposed by a Conservative government and a Conservative County Council. On buses more generally, yes, Labour has recognised the need for re-regulation. We would give local authorities the power to regulate fares and to determine routes in the same way as they have always had that and retain that in London. And those of you who have spent any time in London will know that the London bus service network is extremely good. It's much cheaper than Exeter's, and young people go free or with a discount.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Rob, do you want to come down the front here and grab someone from there?
Hello, I'm actually a serving member of the Armed Forces, and we've heard a lot about how pretty much all of the parties on the stage at the moment are not going to commit to the 2% of GDP. Now, not many people probably realise, but when you first join the Armed Forces, you are on less than the minimum wage if you take into account the number of hours that you work and your salary. Now, all of the parties on the stage, I believe, are on about raising the minimum wage to between £8 and £10 per hour. If you're going to raise the minimum wage for people in the Armed Forces, but you're not going to increase the spending per GDP, what are you going to cut in the Armed Forces?
Keith, that concerns you.
Beyond the minimum wage, that's that. You mentioned trying again, I'll swerve that because you know how I feel about trying. But when I was debating at the university, there were 400 there, and they're much like you, very left-wing bunch. I say it, with YouTube is saying as it is, whether you like it or not. No.
I'll keep the leaving now.
Where was I? Yeah. So,
Left-wing bunch.
So before we actually started the debate, they listed 1 to 10 in priority the students' concerns. And they range on all the normal sort of things. But not one of those priorities, even down to number 10, is defence. Defence. I've already said this evening that 95% of the goods coming into the country come by sea. and we've got 19 surface ships now, so we can't guard our sea lanes. We cannot get a corps into the field, a corps, which is so desperate, it defies imagination. And I cannot believe all those Tories who voted Tories all their life, and seeing this coalition, what they've done to the armed forces, I cannot believe that they're going to vote for them this time around. And we want to do so much for the armed forces, including the welfare and adhering to the military covenant when they come out. We do not have a military hospital, for example. We do not have a military hospital. They go to Birmingham, when casualties from Afghanistan, wherever came to Birmingham. So UKIP is going to ensure that we have a military hospital.
Okay, thank you very much, Keith. Okay.
Sorry, excuse me. Can I just
Yes, please do.
Can I just say I have 3 questions now. The first question.
Before you answer the questions, can I please ask you to state what your party's policy is on spending on defence? The second question, I'd like you to say what your party's policy is on the minimum wage. And the third question is, if you're going to cut defence, but there's a minimum wage, what is it that you're going to cut in defence?
Right.
I think it's really interesting to have a question like that in 3 parts. I mean, to take, I think the second bit first, it's an interesting question about the minimum wage because, as you said, many people join up. The hours that they put in, if you work it out, they get paid less than minimum wage. One thing that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of, because it doesn't affect them personally, is that we don't have a universal minimum wage in this country. If you're under the age of 21, I think it is, then you get paid substantially less than the £6.20, 25. So there's that to consider. And if you're an apprentice, for instance, your hourly wage can be as little as £2 or £3 an hour. I think personally that's an absolute disgrace. And when we talk about £10 an hour minimum wage, we're talking about raising it as a universal minimum wage. And I'd like to hear from Ben if £8 an hour means £8 an hour for everyone, or if it's just people over the age of 21, because I think that's really important. Because there's a lot of people who can vote and might be considering voting for Ben, and they'll want to hear about that. I think it's directly relevant, and the reason I'm mentioning it is because, of course, you can join up for the armed forces when you're 16, I believe. So it's directly relevant there. So even if other parties propose an increase, it might not actually apply until you reach a certain age while you're still in the armed forces. In terms of our policy on spending on the armed forces, we actually think that Britain can do with a radically reduced size of our armed forces. That's our policy. We're an anti-militarist party. We're against war. We think that the armed forces that we have not been put to good use, to say the least, over the past decades. So that's our policy on that. In terms of what we would cut in order to, apart from radically reducing the size of our armed forces to reflect the fact that we're in a fairly peaceful continent, we don't have many natural enemies, what we would cut first of all is Trident. And I think that, the saving on that would be substantial. And then all of our other nuclear weapons as well. So that's what we would cut.
Thank you. Diana.
In 2010 there was a spending review on the level of spending on the military, and the Green Party supports that, so that would be our level of spending that we would spend on defence. And we would want to focus our defence on so that they can more contribute to the international peacekeeping and defending our country. And so you're absolutely right, I mean, Ed is absolutely right as well about the fact that there's a discrimination against young people in terms of the minimum wage, and young people particularly are encouraged to join up in the armed forces, and it's crime shown that they can join when they're 16 but they still can't vote. So we need to make sure there is clarity there, and that they are paid a decent wage, and our policy is a £10 living wage by 2020. And in order to pay for that, in defence, we would cut subsidies to the sale of arms and the arms industry, which is heavily subsidised by this government. And I've already mentioned Trident, which would scrap, but we'd spend that money on the hospitals.
Thank you.
So in terms of the question about defence spending, We wouldn't spend 2% of GDP on the armed forces, but one thing we would do is cut the number of submarines which we have as part of the Trident, as I said, to save £4 billion, to help to ensure that the forces which we do have are properly equipped, so that never again do we have the scandal of British forces are sent overseas without being properly equipped to go into the situations that they'll face. But also I think we need to look more broadly, because obviously the purpose of the armed forces is to protect our country. It's principally their purpose. And we need to look at the type of threats that we'll face in the future, and that's why it's important that we also channel some of our resources now towards and tailor it a bit more towards some of the threats that we face. So one of the things particularly is cyber attacks and the threat of that. So we need to channel resources towards our security services so that they can deal with that. And to just touch on this issue of the minimum wage, I think one of the things actually, we talk about the minimum wage, but actually what matters for people is their take-home pay. And that's why one of the things that I'm most proud about what the Lib Dems have managed to achieve in government is raising the income tax threshold for the lowest earners up from 6,500 up to 10,500 over this Parliament, which has lifted lots of the lowest earners completely out of tax. Here in Exeter alone, 6,000 of the lowest earners have been lifted completely out of income tax altogether as a result of that policy. I'm incredibly proud of that, and that's something which we'll be looking to continue if we're still in government after the next election, and to raise it up to 12,500 to help take the lowest earners out of tax.
Thanks, Joel. Ben?
The UK is actually one of the few NATO members, as I'm sure you're aware, which currently meets its 2% obligations. I think that's a good thing. There is a danger that we'll dip below that, depending on what the next government does. I hope very much that the Labour government will stick to that, because there's a sort of misconceptions about what our armed forces do. Our armed forces don't spend most of their time fighting aggressive wars. They spend most of their time helping people, and particularly helping people in disaster zones and helping the United Nations in many parts of the world keeping their peace. And I think that's a worthy and an honourable thing for Britain, which has a history of internationalism to do and to play our role in those international institutions. I think we can do that while increasing pay in the armed services as the economy grows. I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. And finally, all I'd say is that if the Conservatives win the election, they are committed to bigger cuts in unprotected departments than we've seen in this Parliament in the next Parliament. And defence is an unprotected department. So I'm confident that under a Labour government which is committed to reducing the deficit in a far more balanced way, and without the need for these savage cuts in unprotected departments, the defence, as would other spending areas in government departments, benefit from that.
Thank you.
Alan Helmond, I saw worthiness and honour in an aggressive war that the Labour Party marched us into in Helmond. So I think our troops actually were doing a pretty good job in the two aggressive wars that the last Labour government chose to fight. In specific answer to your question, sir, thank you for pinning us down. I'm torn on this one because my party didn't commit to 2% in our manifesto. I think we should have done, and I hope that we will. But I think the reason that we didn't was because we feel really strongly that before we decide how much we're going to spend on defence, before we decide what we're going to ask you to do overseas in our name, we want to build a strategy. And the mistake the Labour government made, the reason they violated the military covenant, is because they did one strategic defence piece in 1997 or 1998, and then guess what? September 11th happened, and they didn't reconfigure, they didn't decide what they wanted their role to be in the world. And they got themselves into two medium-sized wars when their review said they only had one. So we want to do an SDSR, Strategic Defence Review, in 2016, and then allocate troops to task, or how much money we want to give you, because we'll have determined through the SDSR what we want our role to be in the world, what we want our armed forces to do. And so then I hope we'll commit to 2%. That's my personal view. I think we must do. I think we need it. And in terms of your questions about pay, I don't know the specifics on the minimum wage, but I know that our minimum wage commitment will go up, I think, to £8. And as Joel said, we've actually we've even gone further than the Lib Dems by saying that anybody on the minimum wage won't pay any tax. And you had a third question, which I can't remember, and I'm really sorry.
Yeah, so far, I don't believe anybody's actually answered the question. The point is, if you what would you cut?
The point is,
What would I cut?
if you are going to cap defence at 2%, but you're going to raise the minimum wage, you're going to have to pay soldiers more money, and that's going to come out of that 2%.
If it's going to come out of that 2%, you're going to have to cut something in defence somewhere else. Now, actually, I lied. The Green Party said they were going to cut Trident. I believe you said you were going to cut Trident. You said you were going to cut Trident. UKIP has said they're going to raise defence, so obviously they're not going to cut anything. So the question is really to you and Ben Bradshaw, and neither of you have answered the question.
So I have answered your question, sir, with respect. It's only when you do a full strategic defence security review that you decide what our strategic priorities are, so counter-terrorism, cyber-terrorism, offensive war defence, that you decide how much money you need to spend that, and then how many troops you need to do that, and then you balance your books. I would be being unfair if I just gave you an answer before going through the process. And I've worked with some phenomenal commanders overseas and back here, and if you gave them 30% of their GDP, they'd spend it because they want to look after their men and women. But what the SDSR process has to do is decide what we want to do with our armed forces, and then allocate the money. I'm sorry, I know that sounds like a weasel worded answer, but that is the right way to lead our defence forces.
I don't think that's right, actually. The emerging threat, nobody can say what it's going to be or anticipate what it's going to be. The emerging threat. And I'll just go through what has been cut by this coalition.
No. Ben, can we come back to you? I'm sorry, it's time, Ben.
The 2% figure, the assumption of your question, sir, is that the 2% figure doesn't grow, but as the economy grows, 2% of GDP is a growing figure. So that is how you would enable decent pay to be introduced into the armed services, because if the economy continues to grow, as I hope, and I assume we all hope it will, then that 2% becomes a bigger sum year on year on year.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We're going to get through as many as possible. Rob's got this gentleman there.
You assume it's going to vote?
Is this working?
Yeah, there we go.
I'm concerned about privatisation of the NHS, and I'd like to draw attention to three things with the Royal Dedham and Exeter. The first is that our pharmacy is going to be supplemented by boots, completely unnecessary. Secondly, that we run a dialysis unit in South Molton, which is looking for a private partner at the moment. And thirdly, they're looking for private partners to run pathology. I hope that we are going to be able to defend the public NHS, and I'd like to hear your opinions.
We stand firmly behind the NHS. We fully support the efforts to introduce an NHS reinstatement bill into Parliament, and I think that was a step in the right direction. We need to go further than that now, and we need to recognise that actually it's not just about what this last government has been doing, but it's actually about successive governments over years and decades. Actually, what we need to do now is eliminate the internal market from the NHS. There shouldn't be any role at all for private profit in our NHS. Actually, the NHS, I think, symbolises everything that's good about our society. It shows a way of running essential services and essential things in society for people, not for profit. And we should not only defend that and extend it, but actually introduce that way of running things into other parts of the economy as well, like utilities, like energy. I think, obviously I oppose each of the, specific examples that you gave there.
Thank you. I appreciate the speech. Diana?
The Green Party, Caroline Lucas has been helping to draft an NHS reinstatement bill, so whoever is the next MP needs to really closely read that, support that, because that will put responsibility for NHS back into the hands of the government. We need to exclude the private sector. Private profit, there's no room, it's unaccountable and it's unaffordable. And if we look at why the pharmacy has been privatised, the reason the pharmacy has been privatised is to exploit a tax loophole that was created in the 1970s. There's been plenty of governments who could have closed this. Boots does not pay VAT on its drugs, whereas the NHS does. That's a scandal. Also, the privatisation in the NHS is creeping. It's suddenly services are retendered. So if you look at the walk-in centre in Sidwell Street, now, there's been rumours about what's going to happen to that, and that is proposed to be retendered. We've just discovered this week that actually it's plans to retender that service. And what will happen? It will be removed from Sidwell Street, incorporated into a service on the hospital site, which means that St David's, an area with no GP, and then offering a really important service to local people, will be lost. And so we need to resist this locally, as well as demand that our politicians take action to make sure that the NHS stays in public hands.
Thank you. George. So the fundamental principle behind our NHS is that it should be free at the point of use, and that is a principle which is at the heart of it, which is fundamentally important, and which we're committed to, and which we'd never say, which we'd get rid of. But this isn't going to be a very popular answer to your question. But in terms of the way you phrase it, privatisation, the way some of the candidates so far have been talking about privatisation, it's not something I'm not trying to necessarily recognise the way it's being phrased, because actually I think we need to take such an ideological view of this. Because if a private company can provide services as part of the NHS service which we receive more cheaply than the NHS can, then by all means we should do it. Why wouldn't we do that? And so, by all means, absolutely, we need to be careful with these contracts. We need to be careful with the way contracts are drawn up to ensure that the NHS doesn't lose out. Absolutely, if the NHS can provide, if the states can provide these services more cheaply than private contractors, then it should. That makes sense. But we shouldn't be ideological about these things. And if actually there are private contractors which can provide these services more cheaply, then we should. And that's why under Labour they introduced the tendering out of services, and that's why it's continued under this government. And I'm going to make no apologies for that. But as a second point, I'd just like to say, of course, it is fundamentally important that these services, however they're provided, do have the funding that they require. And that's why I'm proud that the Liberal Democrats are the only major party which has made a fully funded manifesto commitment to plug the £8 billion funding gap in the NHS by 2020. Ben.
I mean, let's be kind of honest about this. There's always been a mixed economy in the NHS. GPs are private contractors, dentists are private contractors. Ever since the 45 Labour government stuffed the GPs' mouths with gold, that was the condition of getting a national health service. Pharmacies are private contractors. Here locally in Devon, we have an excellent breast screening programme, which for years has been delivered by a private company. We have Devon Doctors, who are the out-of-hours service, which is a social enterprise run by doctors themselves. So I agree with Joel to a certain extent. I don't think there's much point in being ideological about it. It's what works for patients and what works for the NHS. The criticism I have of the current government's NHS Act was both the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats said they would have no more reorganisation of the NHS in their manifestos and in the coalition agreement, and the first thing they did was introduce the Lansley Bill, which the then Chief Executive of the NHS, David Nicholson, described as so big you could see it from outer space, the biggest reorganisation the health service has ever seen, costing £3.5 billion, money that could have been spent on patient care. And it's also led to an absolutely disastrous fragmentation of the system, which, yes, has involved a lot more privatisation, a lot more private companies getting the big contracts. We've seen that happening in Devon with young people. We've seen the inability of the different bits of the NHS to get to grips with the scandal of the quality of mental health services for young people, because nobody takes responsibility for what's going on. That has been a complete and utter disaster. And I think it's really, really sad that the Liberal Democrats, including Shirley Williams, actually, who started off criticising this bill, ended up voting for it. I think that's one of the things they will live to regret for a very long time. We are committed to repealing that bill. We're including reintroducing a NHS as a preferred provider principle in the system. I think that is the critical thing, as well, of course, as the extra finances that our NHS needs. You all know about the massive deficit we're facing. Joel or Ed have already talked about the plans for cuts and rationing that I managed to get put on hold in the last few months, but they're still on the spot. We're still facing a £430 million deficit in Devon, the biggest in the country, and the government has refused to come clean in the run-up to the election about what that means, and I think that is a scandal in itself.
On privatisation, I agree with Ben and Joel. I think there's some myths around it. We're not seeing the private sector take ownership of our NHS. The NHS is our NHS, and they're not transferring the ownership of the assets from the state to the private sector. And I think if other providers, including charities, are able to do things better and cheaper, then good on them. Because if that helps me or helps my family out, and good on them. In terms of integration of patient pathway, what Ben was saying, I was, on my last visit to Ardini, I was really, quite taken aback by the perverse incentives that we see across authorities because there isn't that integration of patient pathway all the way along somebody's journey, and I do think we need to do more there. And on the reorganisation, I appreciate it's been controversial, but we're seeing 9,500 more doctors, 7,000 more nurses, 2,000 more midwives, and 6,000 less managers. So, it was a painful process to go through, but the main thing that concerns me is this unprecedented demand with the NHS, and there are more of us, the population's growing, it's an ageing population, there are more people with chronic diseases and more expensive treatments, and despite raising, bringing in an extra 12 billion or 12.5 billion in tough times when the Labour left us with no money, we went to the NHS and we said, what do you need to do? What do you need for the next 5 years in your 5-year forward view? And Simon Stevens said £8 billion, and that's what we found him. And then he said, well, and then once you've given us that, can the politicians step out of the way and give the clinicians leadership of the NHS back? So that's what we've said we'll do.
What was your statistic on managers, on NHS managers?
I think it's 6,000.
So then how can you explain the fact that these statistics also proved that there was one manager for 3 nurses within the NHS?
I said there are 7,000 more nurses total.
Okay, you also said managers.
6,000 less managers, yeah.
There's still...
Fewer.
Yeah, there's still one manager for 3 nurses, which is 2 less.
Well, we brought down the number of managers.
I went into the RDN the other day, it's a particular ward to see my wife. Within the room there were 3 managers sat on their arses on the ward, and the nurses are running around like cupcakes. That can't be right. You only need 1 manager to manage the ward, not 3.
We'll give Keith a chance to speak on that. Keith?
We believe that national service should be free at the point of use, not free at the point of entry. Give an immediate 3 billion cash injection into the National Health Service with no cuts, no privatisation, and we want to link it to social care so that the beds aren't taken up by elderly people who nowhere for them to go. It needs to be really looked at and really sorted out. But I want to say this, hypocrisy again. Under the Labour government, they authorised £70 billion worth of borrowing for the PFI / hire purchase. That is now 300 billion. I saw Labour politicians very often get up and say, well, in the last year, we have built 8 new hospitals. But what they didn't tell you that they were on hire purchase. And now, the National Health Service has to pay 1/3 the repayments of that debt. And that is one of the main reasons, they are not functioning properly and they have not got the money that they need. And I think it's worth mentioning that because of what you hear various parties of what they're going to do. It was the Labour government who really started the ball rolling for a downward trend with the National Health Service with this high cost borrowing, and attached to that, because of an EU regulation, it made it easier for the big corporation to get in on the maintenance side. And when you read in the paper and don't believe it, £150 to change a light bulb, £200 to change a light bulb, it is absolutely true. Because when these large corporations took over the maintenance of the hospitals, they actually pushed the local guys and the local business out of the frame. So it is quite, and you have to have an electrician to change a light bulb. And this electrician may not be in the area where the hospital is, he might have to travel there. And all this was instigated by the Labour government.
Like our own IT system at work. We've probably got about 10 minutes. We can push it a little bit further. We'll try and get as many questions as you can. If you can answer within about a minute, then we'll get to as many questions as we can out of these. These guys will really want some questions. Rob, who have you got?
Hi. I think it's a real shame when walking around the High Street and Princess Gate areas that there is such a lack of independent businesses and shops. And I'd like to know what you would do to try and promote independent business in Exeter and replace some of the chains with independent.
Exeter has the potential to be a really distinctive place, and I'm really pleased to see that there has been a priority given within the bid, the Exeter Business Improvement District, to promote small business, because when you go and look around the areas where they are located, then there's some really interesting things to find. It's very disappointing that the now Tory town centre manager has presided over 10 years of Clone Town, Exeter, and actually brought in and maintained. There's only one independent shop on the high street and one regional cafe. So we need to actually do a number of things. The Green Party would reduce business rates, particularly for small businesses, and help them to get a foothold in. One of the things we also want to do is reform how businesses pay their rates, introducing in the longer term a land value tax. And we need to make sure that in planning terms we actually allocate at least 50% of shops to actually have small businesses. The rents in the high street are astronomical, and if you look on certain business websites, you can see that there's a big turnover, a big churn of the businesses along there. So we need to create a diverse and distinct high street which will benefit our communities, promote local food, and really be something special that tourists will enjoy too.
Okay, I'll try and keep this brief, but there are a whole range of different measures which we can introduce. I met a couple of weeks ago with the Exeter Pound Group, and it's quite exciting to be able to hear about some of their plans to try and promote small businesses here in the city, and try and get some of the excitement from around the Rugby World Cup as well, which will be taking place partly in the city, to try and build on that, to try and promote local businesses. It's also about trying to give young people the skills so that they can set up their own businesses, and that's part of what our expansion of the apprenticeship scheme has been about, to give people an insight into being part of a business so that they can go and do that. And finally, we all have a certain responsibility as consumers in trying to ensure that small businesses can thrive and survive. Because actually, however much help they get from the government, no small business is going to be able to survive if we don't go and take our custom there. And so actually, we have a responsibility to think about where we shop and to think about the sorts of businesses that we support.
Thanks very much, Phil. Ben.
This is one of a number of questions we've had this evening where we could have done someone from the local council actually to answer it, because again, a lot of it's to do with local authorities and how they manage their city centres. And actually, to be fair to Exeter City Council, it's given a lot of support to independent traders, particularly in the 4th Street area, Gandy Street. And if you go around the country and compare Exeter to many other cities, not only do we have a good number of independent traders, but we have a lot more shops that aren't boarded up compared with a lot of other cities, and that's something we should celebrate. I think we have to be realistic about the fact that people's shopping habits and how they use city centres are changing. More and more people, whether we like it or not, whether we do so ourselves or not, are shopping online. And one of the things the City Council, I know, is trying to do is to retain Exeter as an attractive place to come and not just shop, but have cafes, have a meal, go to the cinema, yes, maybe even use a new swimming pool or leisure centre. So you have to have that package together to keep a city alive and thriving, not just through working hours but into the evening as well. As far as government is concerned, I think there are two important things that a Labour government would do. One, we would give local authorities more planning powers to prevent the spread, for example, of betting shops or payday lending shops in a particular part of the city, give them more power to control what happens where. But crucially, and this is a big difference between us and the Conservatives, instead of cutting corporation tax even further, we already have the lowest corporation tax in Europe, very competitive European corporation tax rates, and corporation tax cuts mainly benefit big businesses. We would cut and then freeze business rates, because the thing that local businesses say to me time and time again, that their biggest bill are business rates, and business rates have absolutely soared under this government, and we'd act on that.
Thank you.
Tom, as well as having the lowest corporation tax rates in Europe, we also have the fastest growing economy in Europe. I think first and foremost for small businesses, we need an economic recovery that continues, and I'm not convinced that Ed Miliband is a friend of business. Absolutely, business rates do not pass the common sense test, and we've committed to the most radical evaluation reform of business rates for however long. I think things like the Exeter Pound are really, really important, and actually there's quite a community growing where people want to use independent traders and I've signed up to that and really warmly welcome it. But I would just caution it, it's not an either or. I think sometimes the language you use suggests, this business good and that business bad. And John Harvey's not up here today, so I'm going to defend him because he's 17 years he did serving the city centre, and I'm really grateful and proud to welcome him to the Conservative team because he took the High Street and city centre from a market town to a regional high street, and Exeter is becoming a regional centre. And I don't really understand shopping. I'm not, it probably shows, but I'm not really much of a shopper. But the number of people have told me that say they come to Exeter because of the John Lewis, but then they shop elsewhere at the same time. It's not an either or. There has to be complementarity there. And I think the High Street is a really exciting place to be. And with those support on business rates and encouraging more independent shops, I think we've got a really exciting place to be. Thanks, Tom.
Well, actually, I believe in everything Ben said. I think he's hit it right on the head. I think he's covered all of it, and he's covered what UKIP would do. I would add this though. Parking. If you want to encourage people to come into Exeter City Centre, then stop the high parking charges. Give it for 4 hours. 4 hours so somebody can do a bit of shopping, have a cup of tea, a cup of coffee with their family before you actually start charging them.
Great, thank you very much.
There's been a lot said, and I'm going to be very brief. I think one suggestion that I would like to see pursued is actually, if we're going to talk about lowering business rates for small businesses, I would like to see it incentivised with things like being a living wage employer. I think actually that could create a real connection to communities. It means that people, businesses have a real incentive to be responsible. At the same time, it means they can take on more staff and provide secure and decent employment for them. And the other thing I would say apart from that is investment in infrastructure. I mean, anyone who's walked along Sickwell Street recently, the number of loose cobblestones on there, it doesn't look like an attractive, I have to be honest, doesn't look like an attractive place to go and to shop. And, I'd note the, experience of Plymouth, which, you might know has an independent quarter of shops. I think it's quite, pleasant to be there. And so I think we need to, revamp a lot of the city centre, which is a bit neglected at present. And we also need to make sure that we have the decent transport links, as said before, the buses which actually go along Sickwell Street. We need to make sure they're protected, so if you have businesses that want to open late into the night, cafes, that sort of thing, then they have they know they can rely on the customer coming their way.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Our news editor Rob seems to do fantastic work out there. There are so many hands waving around, and we take a liberty with our panel. If we get one more question from Rob and then do summing up. I wonder if you might just hang on a few seconds. If people have got burning questions here, this is really their one chance to ask it. It'd be really good. We've got some guys at the back.
Do you have the back there?
Oh, Harry.
Back in January, Ben said that the Devon mental health care was in crisis due to lack of beds for mental health patients, and there's also an issue of patients waiting for up to 2 years to receive care. I wonder what the candidates propose to do to improve the situation, especially considering over the past few years funding for mental health has been cut by something like 8.25%.
Sure. Great. I agree. I think it's awful. I think for far too long, parties of all colours have neglected the issue of mental health. It's simply not been on the cards. And that's why it's underfunded. But more importantly than that as well is the esteem in which it's held. It's simply not seen as being important, and that's why it doesn't have the funding. I met with a constituent on Monday to hear about some of the problems that she'd been having as a result of mental health and the lack of support which was there. And it was really moving. And to be honest, I think we should all feel quite ashamed that as a country we're failing to provide the support that so many people need. This constituent should be having problems for 6 years, and there simply hadn't been the support that she needed. And that's why one of the things which we've been trying to do as part of the coalition is to try and raise the profile of the whole issue of mental health, and to try and give it equal esteem and parity with physical health. And that's why we've managed to secure 1.25 billion of funding already to try and put towards that, and we'd be looking to put a total of about 3.5 billion towards helping mental health issues. And you know, one of the things that we try and introduce some basic waiting times, so for instance, so that people with depression get seen within 6 weeks. At the moment, you know, it can be up to almost a year, and of course that's no good. So, you know, somebody might have a relatively small problem. A year later, of course, by then it's a huge problem. And it is, you know, there's a whole range of reasons why we do this. There's the personal reasons for the individuals. There's also the huge amount of, you know, lost working hours to the country as a whole. And also, I was at a meeting with Tony Hogg, the Police and Crime Commissioner, a while ago, and he said, you know, as far as the police are concerned, this is also a real priority for them, because there's just simply not the provision for mental health. And that means that, you know, sometimes there are people with severe mental health issues that are committing relatively minor crimes and they end up being locked up simply because, and what they could actually need is help, not being locked up, but there's just not the services available there. So I think it's a really important issue that you've raised, and I hope that whoever's in government after the election actually starts to address this issue.
Thanks, Joe. It's a very serious issue. I mean, it's not just Devon. There's a mental health crisis across the country. It's particularly bad in Devon. It's particularly bad in Devon for young people. Many of you will have read of the case, and it wasn't an isolated one, of the young teenager who was locked in the police cell for 2 days because there was no bed for her. We've sent more than 40 young people as far as Newcastle because there's been no provision available locally. And you're absolutely right, people are waiting more than 2 years for therapy. What Labour would do is we would give parity to mental health in the NHS constitution to ensure that it was treated equally with physical health, including the application of maximum waiting times. The current waiting time for an operation is 18 weeks, as you probably know. That was the same as that would apply for mental health treatment, including therapies. And we would give parity of funding as well, because although the government can claim with some justification that funding to the health service hasn't been cut in real terms, it's actually been, in absolute terms, it's been cut in real terms because of inflation, but actually mental health funding has been cut quite significantly in the last 5 years, and that has had disastrous consequences. For example, the suicide rate among young people is rising for the first time for several decades. That's extremely worrying. So thanks for the question. A serious challenge, and one that I am confident the Labour government will address.
Thank you. Tom.
Yeah, hand on heart, I think we as a Conservative-led government should have done more for mental health. I know that we found $1.5 billion recently, but I think that was too little, too late. We should have done more, very simply. And I hope that the $8 billion that we've found moving forward, part of that will be, given it, Simon Stevens would have taken that into account when we asked him what he wants. We should have done more.
Okay, thank you. Keith.
Mental health has been underfunded for the last 5 years or more. UKIP will ensure that it is properly funded. Properly funded.
Okay, thank you very much. Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredibly important issue. I mean, some of you may have read that one of the leading causes of death for men between the ages of 16 and 25 is suicide, which is a shocking statistic, and I'd encourage you all actually to check out a charity called CALM, Campaign Against Living Miserably. I think they do great work. In terms of what is going on with the government and mental health funding, it's always been the traditional way, unfortunately, that as soon as any cuts to health and social care provision are proposed, it's always mental health that gets the chop first, and that needs to stop. So I agree with the sentiments about giving it parity with physical health. There's an added question though, which is what are we actually doing to stop people getting into the situation where they find themselves being victimised, particularly with things like people who are having to go through assessments for claiming benefits, disability assessments, implemented by Atos and now by Maximus, which are actually targeting the most vulnerable people in our society who are struggling with. You have people with debilitating and chronic and even sometimes terminal conditions being found fit for work, and the impact that can have on someone's mental health and self-esteem and their hope for the future is absolutely catastrophic. And so we need, it's all very well talking about we're going to give it parity with physical health, but what are we actually doing to ensure that we're protecting people, that we're not victimising people, and we're not pushing people over the edge, as I'm sorry to say, that's been the agenda for the past 5 years.
Thank you.
challenges of our time really, and 28% of illnesses are mental health illnesses, and particularly rising amongst young people. The Green Party will invest £12 billion in the NHS in comparison to investment in mental health services. We need to make sure that people can access talking treatments within 28 days. And I've been really disturbed to hear some stories from people I've met over the past few months, particularly those who've got children who've been wanting to access mental health services. In the life of a child, you cannot afford to wait 2 years before you're assessed. That's really awful. I've also heard about young people that have been put in prison cells to keep them safe because there isn't a bed for them. And this is just utterly wrong. In the southwest, there's something called a concordat, which has been put together by some of the services and agencies that are looking to deliver crisis support from when people are ill. I have asked the question, but nobody's got back to me, about why Virgin Care hasn't signed up to that concordat in terms of how it will cooperate with other agencies and look to provide emergency support. And we also need to look at some of the pressures on young people in society in particular. I think the cuts have created a culture of fear and worry, which is placing a great burden on people. What will happen if I lose my job? What happens if? And I think we need to change that. And one of the other things that has been, is always cut, first of all, along with libraries, is the youth service. And the cuts to the youth service have left a great hole for many young people. Obviously in Exeter there's been things put in place to try and rescue the youth services, but in all the 28 market towns across Devon, there are emergency plans to cobble something together, and this is not good enough. The Green Party will invest in youth services so that young people have safe spaces to go to talk about their concerns and their worries.
Brilliant.
We need to address this as a priority.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Thanks for all your some incredibly well thought out questions there. 2.5 hours these guys have now been talking. Thank you. I do appreciate you taking the time and the trouble with your busy lives at the moment. I do realise how hectic it is. Final summing up, 2 minutes each, and then we'll all head off the side down the end with Ben. 2 minutes, the floor is yours.
You want me to go first again? Okay. I don't really want to repeat what I said in my introduction. There are lots and lots of issues that we haven't covered tonight. I'm aware of that, and many of you who wanted to ask questions and may feel a little bit frustrated or robbed that you didn't get the opportunity. Please, if you haven't already asked me those questions via email or letter or Twitter or whatever, do so, and I will endeavour to the best of my ability, given the demands of the election campaign over the next 2 weeks, to answer those questions in a straight, open and honest manner. The only thing I really wanted to add to what I said at the beginning is that I know that there are quite a lot of people in Exeter, and probably some in the audience tonight, judging from the straw poll earlier, who probably faced a dilemma, and it's a dilemma I faced in the past as a voter, and that is that you may be attracted, and indeed I'm attracted, to a lot of the things that Ed, Diana and Joel have said, but the fact is that because of our flawed election system, there are in reality only 2 people who can win this election in Exeter, and that's me and the Conservative. This was a Conservative seat before I won it in 1997. My majority was reduced to just 2,700 at the last election, and there are only 2 parties that can form the government, and Exeter could determine the outcome of that. As I'm sure many of you know, I have always campaigned for and fought for electoral reform. I'm a long-time member of the Labour campaign for electoral reform. I still support electoral reform. If I'm re-elected, I will continue that fight. It was the Labour Party that introduced electoral reform into Scotland, Wales and in the European elections, and I'm confident of a progressive government in charge. We can achieve that and get rid of the unfairness in our voting system.
Dom, 2 minutes.
It's the Conservative, not Dom, JP. When we arrived in 2010, there was no money left, and we as Conservatives feel that we've turned this economy around. We have provided more jobs than the rest of Europe put together, and we're quite proud of where we've come. And we've made some difficult decisions, and it hasn't been easy. But I've heard a lot of talk from people on the left here about what they spend their money on, but no talk about where they collect it from. And despite all of the difficult decisions... Right, can I finish, guys, please? despite all of the difficult decisions we've made, we still spend more on the interest on our debt and deficit than we spend educating our children. There are no easy solutions to the problems that we inherited in 2010 as a society and as a government. We're going in the right direction, but there is still a lot more to do. And the choice is pretty clear. Do you want to continue in the fastest growing economic recovery across the developed world, or do you want to choose Ed Miliband, propped up by the SNP? Because I'll tell you this, we can continue on the current path, or we can choose Ed Miliband, propped up by the SNP. Taxes will go up, borrowing will go up, and spending will go up. And guess what? Taxes and borrowing will go up down in here in Devon, spending will go up in Scotland. That's the choice we face.
Thank you. Good job you heckled your host for the last question. Okay, over to Keith, 2 minutes. Keith.
I don't need 2 minutes actually. The promises that you've been made, and obviously you've been suckered by the various political parties, particularly in the last month, they won't happen. They won't happen. And if you want to come out of the EU, then obviously you vote for us. If you want to stop 10 billion of the foreign aid budget, then vote for us. If you want to stop HS2 in its tracks and save at the moment about 5 billion, then vote for us. The promises will not be kept. You heard it here first from Keith Crawford, UK.
I didn't realise Don was so interested in where we'd get the money from. I can think of a few examples. We'd implement a European-wide transaction tax on financial transactions. That's a good one. We would clamp down on tax avoidance. People like Philip Green, paying, diverting their profits to a company owned by one. We would, all of these sorts of things. There's actually a lot of wealth in our society, and it's in the wrong hands. So, but there's actually what I would say is, a lot of you wouldn't have known me, didn't know I was standing. You have a choice at this election, a genuine choice. And actually, what's happened over the past 5 years, the growth of, smaller parties, left and right, what it means is that actually, the consensus in politics is actually breaking apart. And that's a good thing in my opinion. If people are actually able to engage with politics and find, someone who agrees with them, not just the least worst option, but someone who actually says what, real things that could affect their lives, that they are in favour of, that's only a positive thing. So I would encourage you, do not vote for what you think is the least worst option, because you will be in that situation again in 5 years' time. Vote for what you believe in. We are, we're the socialist alternative of this election. We want to be around for a long time to come. We want to have more candidates in the city council, county council elections next year. Vote for us if you stand for a society that's run for people, not profit. Vote for good public services. Vote for higher wages. Vote for better jobs, terms and conditions. Vote for all of these things. If you believe in all of that, then you should vote socialist at this election.
Thank you.
This country still faces 3 connected crises. We need to heal our planet and our country from the effects of unstable and unsustainable economy. We need to create a more equal society and reverse the divide between the poor and those that are very wealthy. And those with the broadest shoulders should really pay their fair should towards it. We need democratic central and local government that governs for the common good. So the Green Party does not apologise for having a bold and ambitious plan, a long-term plan which addresses these challenges for our country. Because we cannot continue on our current path of austerity. And if you choose one of the main parties, you will be choosing further austerity. And it's good to hear Ben talk about his commitment to PR. It's disappointing that as a member of Tony Blair's cabinet in 1997, he didn't implement their promise then. When you were a minister then in Tony Blair's government in 1997, they promised to introduce PR, it didn't happen. So you are being urged as honest voters to collude in failed tactical voting. I say that you should vote for what you believe in and move us away from the failed politics of the past. It is policies, not personalities, that are going to make the difference in the next 5 years. A vote for the Green Party, nationally and in City Council elections, is a vote for the common good. Thank you.
John.
Okay, as I said in my opening speech, in 2010 the Liberal Democrats had a very difficult decision to make. Would we go into coalition with the Conservatives? It was a very difficult decision, but ultimately I think we made the right decision. We helped to provide a country with stable government, we helped to get a grip with the deficit, we've now got one of the highest growth rates of any developed economy. But actually, the policies which I'm most proud of are those which we've managed to implement, which help the disadvantaged people. I'm really proud of the fact that we've introduced a pupil premium to help the most disadvantaged students and narrow the attainment gap between them and their peers. I'm proud of raising the income tax threshold to lift the lowest earners out of tax. I'm proud of the increases in apprenticeships. I'm proud of the fact that we've introduced gay marriage. I'm proud of the fact that we've increased our aid spending up to our international commitment of 0.7% of GDP. And the question that I put to you is, do you think these policies would have been implemented if we didn't have the Liberal Democrats in government? But as we look forward to this election and start thinking about what sort of a government we're going to have, it looks increasingly likely that no single party is going to actually manage to get a majority, which means that there'll always be another party propping up either Labour or the Conservatives in order to make a majority. That could be the SNP dragging Labour further to the left. It could be UKIP and the DUP dragging the Tories further to the right. But if, like me, you want to stop our politics lurching between the right and left, if you want to anchor our politics in the centre ground, then vote Lib Dem. If, like me, you want to create a stronger economy and a fairer society, and to do so in a responsible way which provides opportunity for everyone, then vote Liberal Democrat. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause for all our candidates this evening? I think they've done a fantastic work. Whatever the policies this evening, what's been very, very clear is they've all got the best interests of Exeter at heart, and it's been amazing to see. Thank you so much for coming out today. I really appreciate the time and trouble. Thanks very much. Safe journey home. I'm sure the candidates will come and speak to you and get questions. Thank you.